If you haven't seen the comic on there, that's just a nod to the fact that we talked about Thomas Becket last time. He's getting stabbed in the head, and he says, trying to reason with King Henry gives me a splitting headache. So yes, check that out when you can see the slides. Today's conversation, the last of our conversations, unfortunately, is going to be talking about Nazi origin stories specifically. So from the First Reich to the Third, and we'll talk about the first two Reichs in a second. But as always, we must begin with a medieval marginalia. How are you feeling today? So please pick one of these owls and describe to your seatmate which owl you are feeling like today. I am very much the second one with the hair. Please talk amongst yourself. Yes, and friends online, tell me which one you are in the chat.
Ford looks like he's getting too beat up.
They're a little pixely,
Exactly. Yeah, number 5 is definitely
happily, I always teach my medieval class in the spring, so I always do this after the Super Bowl, and I make a joke about superb owls. Oh, right? See, they don't laugh. I appreciate your laughing. All right. So where have we been so far in this course? I always like to remind people, A, who haven't been here, or B, who have, and weren't sort of absorbing all the things. Where have we been thus far? So the first thing we began with was talking about what medieval history has to do with white supremacy at all. We talked about medievalism, and we really latched on to Cord Whitaker's shimmering metaphor, the idea that there are granules of history, of fact, that absolutely happened, but that change when we put them in narratives based on who we are. So things like a metaphor, you know, we see in the distance something happening, but where we are changes how we understand what's happening. So we talked about Cord Whitaker, and we talked about our role in destabilizing these origin stories. The second week, we talked about conversion and empire. We talked about the uncomfortable way that Christianity has played a pretty significant role in empires of the past, particularly talking about Constantine, Clovis, Charlemagne, and we talked about the role that conversion and faith in particular played in solidifying a political identity. So what does it mean when you're Charlemagne and all of a sudden you're not just Charlemagne, you're king of the Franks, crowned king of the Franks by the Pope? How does that change who you are? And we started talking about the idea of sacred kingship and the anointing of the divine on political entities and how that changes the narrative that those people tell about who they are, right? And we thought to ourselves, how does that affect contemporary presidents and their understanding of faith and the understanding of our understanding of the role that faith plays in American identity? We started thinking about that. And we've talked also about the Umayyads and the way that Islam also forged kind of a transnational identity, something that superseded local regional identities in North Africa and Asia Minor, and became a new kind of identity that superseded those super regional identities. And then last week we talked about Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. We were particularly troubling that origin point for contemporary white supremacists where they look to the past and say, these past white people, that's who we are now. We come from these super masculine, super white, blonde men running around the globe, taking stuff from people. Right? Right? How did we problematize that narrative, people who were here last week? I know who you were. I'm going to flip to you in a minute.
They weren't always white.
They weren't always white. Certainly weren't always white. What else? They certainly weren't Christian. Certainly weren't Christian. Mostly were a hobnob of Germanic tribes, some folks from Denmark, some folks from Norway. It was more a system that was syncretic. And we looked at this Frank's casket, which is a whalebone small box that has origin stories from Christianity, from Roman history, from Norse and Viking history, all smashed together in one space to kind of say, first of all, there's nothing pure about this narrative. And there's nothing explicitly white about this narrative either. It's syncretic, and that's your GRE word of the day. If you're going to take it from last week. Syncretism, which is a melding of cultural identities, usually religious ones, in order to create a new shared identity, right? So there's nothing pure, white, or Christian about the Viking past, and yet we get to the Nazis, and we think about the Nazis and where they get their origin stories. Contemporary white supremacists often find particular kinship with the Nazis, and we'll see why that's the case. But here's a history question for any of you who are history buffs. What were the first two Reichs? The Nazis call themselves the Third Reich, or the Third Kingdom. What were the first two?
Holy Roman Empire. And Kaiser Wilhelm.
And you, Alan got them both. That was going to do a trivia question. We're not going to do a trivia. Alan got them all. The First Reich is the Holy Roman Empire, as my beloved mentor said, not so holy, not so Roman, not so much of an empire. But the origins of the Holy Roman Empire are actually with Charlemagne, when he is crowned in the year 800 by Pope Stephen on Christmas Day, and he is surprised that this happens. It's my favorite part of Einhorn's biography. He's like, oh my gosh, this crown, it's all there. No, that was not a surprise to him. But the idea is this is the first time that someone is being crowned as king of the Holy Roman Empire. And this continues this identity of Holy Roman Empire-ness, where we see this connections between the papacy and the political identity of the Franks get sort of mooshed up together in really interesting ways. And the Nazis will find their particular origin point, historically speaking, actually not with Charlemagne, but with the Ottonians who follow Charlemagne. But fun fact, that title, Holy Roman Emperor, is used by leaders of that region from the year 800 up until 1806. Yeah, so that's the First Reich. The Second Reich, of course, that we got here is the German Empire 1871 to 1918, which begins with the unification of German states with Otto von Bismarck. I feel like my European history teacher should be in this class, because I should be so proud that I remember who Otto von Bismarck is, because this, by the way, is way past my history. This is contemporary stuff, speaking. But it ends in the shift from the governmental structure from monarchy to republic. When we think about this period, we think about industrial technology, scientific advancement, and at the time, Germany was the largest economy in continental Europe and the third largest in the world. So what does it mean then when Hitler takes over and he describes the political entity he's creating as the Third Reich? What does that do to the narrative to say, I'm not just Adolf Hitler, leader of contemporary Germany, it's I'm Adolf Hitler, the end point of these two previous Reichs. How does that change the narrative?
Well, it makes it divine right.
We certainly get divine right of kings sort of floating in there, absolutely. And I'll point specifically, this was in the New York Times on September 5th, 1934. Chancellor Adolf Hitler today proclaimed the arrival of the Nazi millennium, predicting that the next 1,000 years would not witness another revolution in Germany.
Millennial.
Oh, we got our millennial in there, absolutely. Yes, our millenarianism, our sort of the sacrality of particular numbers, the idea that it's been an entire millennium of German ascendance, irrespective of the details, because we'll get to the details then, not quite right. What does this do to this narrative? Yeah, Leslie.
Sarah, was he also referring to the German wars of the 1850s?
He was,
where
yes.
a lot of our relatives, including mine, came from there to here to get away from.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're creating a very particular narrative here, a positionality that we see. Do you think there's a progressive model to this history, right? We've got a First Reich, Second Reich, Third Reich. Best Reich, maybe? Most effective Reich? This man, Adolf Hitler, and his crew knew how to tell a story. And we're going to look at specifically the layers of that story and how we can sort of pull some of that apart a little bit. So, yes, sir.
It's also interesting to
Yeah.
look, if you flip back, the headline, Roosevelt names board of 3. Roosevelt names board of 3 to mediate and textile strike, 2 dead, 24 shot, and riots at mills. So it says where the United States is. It was a very, we're in a tumultuous time now, but
Absolutely.
they were then for sure.
Absolutely. Yep, and we'll see how important it is to create a shared sense of identity, to shore up the usness versus themness, to create a sense of stability. Whether or not that stability is genuine, the idea is we're okay as long as we recognize who we are and who they are. And the way that the Nazis build up this particular narrative is very, very interesting. And if we say the story begins with Charlemagne, and this is Charlemagne getting crowned in the background, surprise, oh, Charlemagne, you're emperor now. Anyway, it actually begins before that. It begins before that, as with so many things in the medieval period. The origins are much more in the tribal identities pre any unified sense of nation state in Western Europe, right? So who recognizes what this scene is from? Charlottesville. And these are folks running around with this particular shield on the left-hand side, which is called the Schwarze Sonne, or the Black Sun, sometimes called the Sonnenrad. It's become synonymous with myriad far-right groups who traffic in neo-Nazi and or neo-folkish, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, ideologies. It's based on sun wheels of the 6th and 7th century made by the Alemanni, who were one of the many tribes in Western Europe that were running around before they consolidated into one particular political identity. It also shows up on the New Zealand Shooters Manifesto on the right-hand side there, at the very center of the Great Replacement theory that he was talking about. Right? The version is also inlaid into the marble floor of Castle Vesselberg, that we'll see here, which is a sort of the cultural, spiritual, literal home of Nazi identity in the Third Reich. And what's important about the Sonnenrad and the idea of this black sun is that it's syncretic in all the ways we've seen before. It has a little bit to do with Germanic tribal identity. It's also used by Norse and other Germanic tribes as a symbol of their pagan beliefs. So what's important about this is that it's not Christian. And the Nazis are very much not Christian. And the Virgin here, like I said, is sort of in the center of Castle Vesselberg, which is the castle that Heinrich Himmler, who we're going to learn a lot about in a second, made the spiritual and literal home of the SS during the reign of the Third Reich. So the story doesn't actually begin with Charlemagne. It begins with that sort of group of tribes in Western Europe before we had any particular nation or identity. But if the story begins with Charlemagne, if we're going to begin with that, then we have to start with the gloop of the Western Frankish states, right? So what do you see here? You see a lot of small states surrounded by some lighter greens, some darker greens. Despite Charlemagne's attempt at centralizing all the things, he never fully created a Frankish identity because each of these small states had their own cultural identities. And the most important, significant of these identities were the Saxons up here in the top. What's important about the Saxons is they were the last group to be incorporated into the Frankish Empire. Does anyone remember, who was at our conversion class, how they got incorporated into the Carolingian Empire? Were they invited in with banquets and feasts? You say, we'd love to have you here. That's a joke. No, they were not. They were actually brought in quite forcefully. And we'll see here, there's Carolingian, quote unquote, missionary St. Boniface destroying a sacred grove. They were brought into the Carolingian Empire by battle. And the Saxon invasions lasted for more than 30 years with the goal of enculturation into Carolingian Frankish identity. And this resulted in many, many, many people either being baptized as Christian Franks or killed. And in 782 in particular, Charlemagne is said to have decapitated 4,500 Saxon prisoners in Verdun in response to the destruction of a particularly significant sacred grove. So it probably comes as no surprise then that after Charlemagne's death, I'm going to go back to this map here, how do you think Charlemagne brought all these different entities together to make a quote unquote empire? Aside from, forcibly converting them. That's not gonna all do it all. How else did he bring people in and make it sort of a stable entity? Just like several weeks ago. Part of what he did was standardizing all of the practices related to what it meant to be Frankish. So he created, not he personally, his group of scholars created a standard liturgy, Carolingian liturgy, that was the missal that was going to be used for all worship. They required all monastic houses to be Benedictine monastic houses. They solidified education. There's a standard practice of education that allowed people to know what it meant to be. And then they started a sort of literary campaign where it talked about what it meant to be Frankish. Does this remind anyone who was here last week of anything? This is exactly what King Alfred did in England, right? How you create a sense of shared identity, you actually create literature around that identity and you put it in your school systems.
Huh, sounds familiar.
It does sound familiar, doesn't it? We all know the George Washington and the cherry tree, right? Well, okay, maybe we don't, but that was a part of some of my education.
Yeah.
So Charlemagne brought everybody together. Unfortunately, his kids weren't as good at it as he was. So Louis the Pious, who's Charlemagne's son, depicted here on the right in Rabanus Maurus's Carmina Figurata, which are poems that read left to right, but then have particular things brought out in the nimbus, for example. It says, Tu Ludovicus cum Christe corona. So in that nimbus, the part that goes around here, it's like a word search. It says, you, Louis, are crowned with the cross of Christ. So these poems read left to right, and then inside them are some other special things, including ones in the cross and in the shield. And my advisor would always say, well, Sarah, the poems aren't very good. Well, okay. Sorry, my standards are lower than his. Louis was an amazing scholar. He, although depicted as a soldier here, not a soldier at all. He continued the standardizing reforms begun by his father, particularly talking about church order, monastic order, and liturgy, and was very fortunate for him that he was the only surviving son of his father, Charlemagne. Now, his kids, not quite so much. There are actually 3 children that outlived Louis the Pious, and they have fun names like Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. There's also Charles the Simple and Charles the Fat. I would always be Sarah, tired but trying. My evil name. So, what's problematic about this? In the medieval period, we did not have primogeniture. What's primogeniture? Firstborn son gets everything. Now, that didn't exist at this point, and there's also 3 surviving sons. How do you think this went for everyone? Well, they all got to a table, they all said, hey, we're gonna divide it up, it's gonna be great. Yeah. We had all-out war, particularly because, I don't know if you can see from this map, Lothar and Louis the German are children of Louis the Pious with Ermengarde, whereas Charles the Bald is a child of Louis the Pious with Judith of Bavaria. And there's a very saucy story about that I will not tell right now, but find me afterward if you want to hear about it. So they basically have infighting for about 50 years, that's an exaggeration, like 15 years, until they come to the Treaty of Verdun, at which point they decide, well, we're going to divide up Charlemagne's kingdom into 3 slices. We have the kingdom of Charles on the left, the kingdom of Lothar in the middle, and the kingdom of Louis on the right. What happens to empires when you start dividing them up under individual kings? Not so much an empire anymore, right? Yep. So the unitedness of the Carolingian Empire never remains after Charlemagne, and in fact, we see lots and lots and lots of infighting. That breakdown of the empire is only facilitated further by the raids of the Saxons, of the Magyars, of the Vikings, right? So small regional kingships start to emerge as the real core of power in the Carolingian former empire. We don't really have an empire anymore. We just got a lot of small states that are ruled by single militaristic leaders who can enforce their authority on a particular geographic area. Not so much empire anymore. So you'll see lots and lots of these lines are all the incursions from different areas from external forces. And from this goop, I love calling it goop, the primordial ooze, this goop emerges a new potential ruler, and his name is Henry Fowler. Apparently because he was birding when they found, yeah, these names, it's amazing. So the best thing about Henry Fowler is, number one, he's from Saxony. The Saxons were never fully incorporated into Carolingian identity, right? So it's significant that our new first emperor comes from this period, this place where Charlemagne had so forcibly converted and decapitated so many people. So Henry Fowler is, and this is the best story of Nazi identity, Henry Fowler is elected as king. And the Germans are very proud of this. They're like, we had the first democracy since the Greeks. Do you think this man was elected? No. This man had the best army. And so it was in everybody's interest to be like, you know what? I'm going to vote for this guy to be our ruler, right? And he, for the first time since Charlemagne, is able to consolidate authority because all the rest of the Frankish nobility has been decimated by all those raids and by the split of the previous Carolingian Empire, right? It's exactly what happened to Alfred the Great in England. The Vikings knocked out all the smaller kingdoms above him, and then he saved everyone from the Vikings and created a new English identity. The other great thing about my dear friend Henry Fowler is that he was married to Matilda, who was a Saxon princess herself. And the best thing about this period is that we get so many wonderful women. So Otto the First is the son of Henry Fowler, married to Edith, who was daughter of Edward, the King of England. He expands into Italy in 951 and 955. He's crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 962. Whatever. Love Otto, but love the ladies even more. Otto expanded all of the Ottonian Empire back to the farthest reaches that Charlemagne got. And part of the way that he did this was by allying himself with local monastic and clerical elites, right? This is how do we consolidate power and hold power? By making relationships, forging relationships. It's like if the mayor of Atlanta was like, hey, Trinity people, wouldn't it be great if we were allies and built some cool stuff around here and did some great charity work together, right? That's how the Ottonians made their sort of areas strong. The other thing that's unique about the Ottonians is they had an itinerant kingship. What does that mean? What does itinerant mean? This is another charity word for the day. They moved around. They traveled. The Ottonians had no single capital. Why would anyone choose that?
Because everybody would have a capital.
Everyone can have a capital, yes. And every place is uniquely significant, right? It also means that the emperor, the king, gets to see every part of his empire as he moves around. And when the emperor arrives at a new place, he just gets to feed off of the stuff that's there, right? People host him. He spends his whole life being a celebrated guest. That's not terrible, right? He also gets to show his power in various places. And it also means when people host him, they have unique access to the emperor. And what's important about all of this is that some of the places that hosted him and were some of his greatest allies were women's monastic communities. Women's monastic communities led by women, for women, and they were led in particular by some women who were nobles themselves. So Theophanu marries Otto II, who is the son of Otto I. And I just want you to see this gorgeous manuscript. This is the marriage charter. I saw this in person. It was amazing. It is exactly this purple and gold vellum. You just can't experience it. It's also really long. It's like 3 feet long. So love it. Big fan of that. And what's great about the Ottonian women is that not only are they powerful in liturgical spaces and monastic spaces, they're also powerful in political spaces. Otto II has the misfortune of dying, and Otto III, his son, ascends to the throne when he's 3. You can imagine that 3-year-olds are not going to be great at ruling empires, right? They're not great at like eating wrongly cut sandwiches. They're not going to be great at ruling empires. So Theophanu, his mother, Adelaide, his grandmother, and Matilda of Quedlinburg, which is going to be our favorite German word of the day, Quedlinburg, which is a monastic community, actually rule in his stead. Ottonian women are amazing. The itinerant court in particular makes these women's monastic houses really significant in the fact that they do the liturgical celebration of the Ottonian history. So we're talking about stories we tell. Where the story of Ottonian history is told is in women's monastic communities, and in particular, by my favorite person, She's hilarious. She's actually hilarious. I could talk about for years and years because she's who I wrote my dissertation on. In addition to writing 2 histories, the history of the Ottonians, she was commissioned by Otto II to write the history of the Ottonian family. She also wrote a history of her monastic house at Gandasheim, and she wrote a bunch of really hilarious plays. That's why she's up here with Tina Fey. She is hilarious. There's a whole scene where a Roman emperor is trying to embrace these Christian women, and he ends up in a broom closet embracing pots and pans rather than the women because it's awesome. She bases her plays on Roman comedies like Terence and Plautus, but instead of having the Roman men be the sort of heroes, it's the Christian women that are heroines in her plays. And it's the Roman men that look like idiots in the broom closet embracing pots and pans. She's amazing. This woman has a whole corpus of texts, saints' lives, plays, and histories from the 9th century. Ottonian women are amazing. If you are going to time travel and you are a woman, I would highly recommend the 10th century in Germany. That's where you want to go. Probably even better if you're monastic, because then you can avoid the whole thing. So, Clamor validus Gandasamensis, her voice, she's the strong voice of Gandasheim. And Gandasheim itself, to give you a sense of what these monastic communities were like, the abbesses had their own armies, they minted their own coins, they oversaw their own land. They basically did whatever the heck they wanted. There were more princedoms than convents. And these are run by women, many of whom are connected by blood to the royal family, so that's helpful. But they're also just amazing. And this is the period of history the Nazis chose to screw up. Oh, so frustrating. This is the one extant manuscript of Probst's narratives. This is in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich. Highly recommend. Go see it if you want. This is a time period where we see this is Matilda, one of the abbesses on a processional cross. This is also a time period when we see all kinds of amazing metalwork. This is also the first time we start seeing life-size wooden crucifixes. For the first time in the West with Christ dead. In the Carolingian period, you only see very triumphant, very looking ahead, very I'm hanging out on this cross for fun Jesus. During this period, thanks to connections with the Byzantine East, we start to see a different understanding of who Christ was. And you see these life-size crucifixes, which create a very different Eucharistic space, right? When you've got a life-size crucifix and you come up and you take part in the Eucharist, it changes the narrative of how you exist. And I have whole thoughts about that. That's not what we're talking about, unfortunately. Metalwork, large-scale metalwork. This is an amazing, amazing time period. It is great. And yet the Nazis chose this spot in history, my beloved Ottonians, as the source of their identity as the Third Reich. How did they use this story, this place where women were amazing? We made fun of, they turned this into their particular narrative, and they did this by using medieval history, their version of medieval history, to shore up a collective German identity. We've seen this over and over and over again. It's all about creating an us versus them and an us who have a very specific past. This is the past they pointed to. They have a very different interpretation of that past than I do, naturally. There's a word for this in German, Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community. And this is the idea in Nazi Germany that there is a racially unified, hierarchically organized body in which the interests of individuals would be strictly subordinate to those of the nation, or the folk, the people. What jumps out at you in that particular definition?
Racially unified.
Racially unified, yes. The Übermensch looks like like the Viking running around with the blonde, blue eyes, masculine identity, hyper-masculine identity.
Yeah, but it suppresses individual thought as well.
Exactly. The goal here is not to make you more you, it's to make you more German. In service of German identity, right? And the way that they were able to create this Volksgemeinschaft is by saying we Germans have this shared unique past that is medieval. And they made these sort of medieval timesy places early in the 20th century, and this is from a great article that I can send you. It's no coincidence that castles and medieval villages functioned as objects of mediation between local culture and the nation state in Germany, at least since the 19th century. So the castle, this image of medieval, becomes an instrument of political demonstration and ideological projection during the 19th century. It becomes a symbol of unity that represented a national imagined community, right? There's a reason that kids are taught about the founding fathers in schools, because it's a part of who we see ourselves to be as a nation. The Nazis saw these castles and this imagined medieval past as the source of that shared cultural identity.
Sarah,
Yes?
are you familiar with Leni Riefenstahl's films? That
No.
were made? Oh my gosh, this fits right into what you're talking about. And there's a woman,
Okay.
filmmaker, who
Yeah.
made some films that everybody can go online and look at, and they're amazing, representing the same idea.
Yeah.
The 1936 Olympics.
Yep.
In Berlin, she made all these films. It does exactly this. So there is a woman there, but you know, she's not totally free. But.
Yes. Indeed. And this propaganda, because it is propaganda, right? Historical propaganda, this retelling of this particular story takes different shapes. So you can't actually see these from far away, but these are stories of redone medieval towns that are opened like festivals. This sort of historicizing, this faux historicizing for creating a shared sense of past. They would redesign castles to look like what they thought castles should look like. And this is Trifle's Castle, which is known for being the place where Richard the Lionheart was captured en route back from the Fourth Crusade. So they literally redesigned these spaces to serve as symbols. And nowhere does that symbol become more significant than at Quedlinburg. Can everyone say that with me? Quedlinburg. Try one more time. Quedlinburg. That's probably not how you were going to say that, right? Have I been in academic spaces where I said that wrong? Yes. Am I trying to save you from that? Yes. Welcome. So Quedlinburg becomes the focus of this particular re-storyfying of this narrative. Heinrich Himmler. Does anyone know who Heinrich Himmler is? We're all nodding. Someone who's nodding, tell me who he is.
Some dude.
Is some dude, yes, absolutely. Which dude? The SS guy, right? Absolutely. He was the core of all these identities. He's the head of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, also leading party, member of the Nazi Party. And he's the one who founds in 1935 a group called the Achernaba. It's a branch of the SS designed to, quote, research ancient cultures and practices in support of efforts to establish a coherent and superior Aryan culture, which would be adopted by the Third Reich after the war. What do you notice about this seal of the Achernaba? Does it look kind of faux Norse to you? Faux Viking? Yes, we're going to start seeing this mishmash of cultures put together to create an imaginary past. And he does this in a couple really, really specific ways. Himmler transforms Quedlinburg. Remember, Quedlinburg was a female monastic community that was at the center of this liturgical celebration of the Ottonian history. Women were at the core of who Quedlinburg was. And Himmler transforms Quedlinburg into a National Socialist Camelot. the Abbey Church as the focal point for SS ceremonies and memorials dedicated to the first ruler who ostensibly unified the Germans, aka Henry Fowler, our elected king. So how does this play out? Well, it plays out in a couple very specific ways. The question first is, why would you choose Quedlinburg? Well, first of all, Quedlinburg is Romanesque, not Gothic. The Nazis thought the churches that had all the Gothic architecture were too French. We don't want that. So we picked a Romanesque church, which is much simpler in its architecture, right? So that's the first bit. The second bit, so this is, for example, Romanesque on the right, Gothic on the left. We know Gothic from the very the fancy swirls and spires. Romanesque are very sturdy and squat and German. So the second reason we picked here is because Heinrich Himmler sees himself as a literally reincarnated Henry Fowler, who defeated the Magyars and created a unified German identity. And so he actually redesigns Quedlinburg to tell this particular narrative. And this is a letter from Himmler to the director of the race office from 1935. If we present Henry I as the first German king, then the fact is that the millennium celebration next year, because Henry died in 936, would propagate, I don't know what the German word is that they translated as this, but it's a great word, propagandistically be a literal gift from heaven. Heinrich Himmler says, aha, this is a perfect story to tell. We're the reincarnation of that first Reich. And gosh, it's happening like exactly a millennium after it first happened. This is so great. So, what does he do to Quedlinburg to make it a site of Nazi identity? He removed the Gothic choir that had been added in the 13th century, which is the back where all this stuff happens, replaced it with a half dome. He removed the pulpit, he removed the altar, he removed the pews and put in removable chairs that had been made at Dachau. He changes the stained glass in the rear of the cathedral with an eagle with a swastika in its talons. He widens the nave to make space for processions. He gives a speaking platform, a rostrum. He renames Quedlinburg King Henry's Hall, which it most certainly was not. And he broadcasts his speech at the opening of King Henry's Hall, accompanied by Scandinavian trumpet music, because that makes sense. In this speech, he says, we can best honor Henry Fowler, first German king, by giving our total loyalty to the man who, after a hiatus of 1,000 years, has taken up King Henry's legacy, our Führer Adolf Hitler. That's really on the nose. There's no nuance there at all, right? 1 year later, archaeologists miraculously discover the bones of Henry I. And his tomb is put in the center of the nave. You can see here replacing those of the abbesses. Literal rewriting, redesigning of history, right? There's nothing nuanced at all. And what's important here is that this is a very particular narrative making Henry and the Ottonians non-Christian. And Himmler specifically is very anti-Christian. What is Christian is not Germanic. What is Germanic is not Christian. Masculine pride, valor, and loyalty are Germanic, not meekness or remorse, misery over sins, and a hereafter with prayers and psalms. So this is a fundamental rewriting of Ottonian history to craft a particular narrative about the Nazi present that divorces it from so many things. So in seeking ties to King Henry, Himmler sought to restore the true will of the Germans, who had been subjugated to Christian ideology for an entire millennium. Fascinating. This narrative has been restored, recreated, renamed by contemporary white nationalists, who say that white men need to be forming tight-knit, leaderless, and autonomous militant collectives in our inner cities. There must be bands of white men everywhere that can secure white well-being, where we will become an increasing minority in an increasingly hostile climate. It is no mistake that contemporary white supremacists see Nazi Germany as the most immediate precursor to their political and ideological aims. Both have a fundamental misunderstanding of history. Both focus specifically on white men and the alienation of the other as a part of solidifying who we are, right? And Stormfront is the online forum, I guess we could call it, for white supremacists. Says, we are the voice of the new embattled white minority. What does that narrative tell you about these people? What story are they telling? No.
It's interesting they got a Roman aqueduct.
They do. They have a Roman aqueduct. White pride worldwide.
Yep.
Every month is White History Month. That's on there, huh? Oh, it's true. Yep. So, what is the role of the church in troubling this story? Yeah. John?
I wonder if it's this. As animals, human beings, we're running packs. We ran in packs and we're predators.
We want to belong.
We want to belong, but we also eat what you kill.
Yeah.
So if you think about Christ's teachings, the teachings in the Bible is to love
Some of them.
all of them,
Yeah.
to love your neighbor, love everyone.
Yeah.
And that directly challenges the DNA that's in us. These stories appeal to that primordial DNA.
The threat.
Particularly to males,
Yes.
particularly the males that
Absolutely.
feel like they've been not appreciated would be a kind word, but feel like they've been they've dealt with sort of a bad hand.
And we talked earlier about the Battle of Tours and the way that the Franks changed that narrative from, this group coming to battle us here. It's the Muslims are coming to erase Christianity, right? There's a value in that narrative of we are the minority, we are under attack, because when you're in that panic state, nuance doesn't really matter, does it? So our job is to, in some ways, lift up alternative narratives from Scripture. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know a lot of Christians that they are constantly talking about how they are under attack.
Yes.
The media is attacking
Absolutely.
them, society is attacking them.
Yeah.
That's a big theme, big part of their Christianity.
Yes, it is.
And it's like they talk about fight. It's very warlike.
Absolutely, the fight or flight works. Yeah. So what's our job, other than lifting up alternative narrative, scripturally speaking? What do we do?
Change the narrative.
Change the narrative. All right, Leslie, how do we change the narrative?
By going back to the original source.
Yes, which is?
Well, everything John said and everything else. I mean, I think of the Gospels.
Yeah.
Which are so
Yeah.
distant from all of this.
Yeah. And also to own the ways in which Christian history has been shaped by violence and anti-racial. I mean, the fifth session that I would do if I had more time would be on the Crusades, right? Which is religiously motivated political war. So part of this is owning the degree to which Christianity is complicit in Christian nations, and the idea of a Christian nation is complicit in this narrative. It's a shimmering metaphor, right? that part of Christianity and white people, and that's at the core in many ways of the story we tell about Christianity. So part of it is telling other stories. And part of it is thinking through how we ourselves have contributed to these stories, right? I gave you a medieval class that had nothing to do with non-white people, right? Turns out there's a lot of stuff going on in the 10th century in North Africa, in China. So there's no perfect answer to this, and I would love to keep having these conversations. You have to get to church. Becca's just left, so you have to go to church too. Thank you so much for having me. I would love to keep talking about this. Come get my card. We'll keep talking.